Welcome back. This is day 4 of Ecology, and today we're going to be talking about how can we evaluate the factors affecting populations in an ecosystem. But before we get to that, let's take a look at this do not question together. So we're told that species of finches are represented in the diagram below, and we're asked to state the name of one species of finch from this diagram that is most likely to compete with the small tree finch if they lived on the same island. And as always, support your answer with an explanation. So this diagram looks really confusing. So let's see if we can figure it out together. Now, looking at the outer layer of this diagram, we're actually just looking at the names of different types of finches. So the one that we're going to be focusing on is the small tree finch, which is found right here. Right now, these two lines are going to be what you're going to follow all the way inward when looking at the different characteristics of our small tree finch. Okay, and we're going to go through each one of these lines or each one of these rings and figure out what they mean. So after we've looked at the name of the small tree finch, that next ring is showing us just the essential shape and size of the beaks that we're looking at. So for our small tree finch, this is what he looks like right here. Let's keep moving inward, okay? The next two rings are actually just telling us what their bills or what their beaks are really good at doing. So for our small tree finch, his beak has got biting tips and grasping bills. Right now, if we keep moving in one more further, this innermost ring is showing us what type of food these birds like to eat. Okay, so for our small tree finch, we're going to follow this line right here, which shows us that they, along with these other animals right here, eat mainly animal food. Now, think about what animals are going to compete with our small tree finch. What do you think they're going to be competing over? I don't know. Pause this video, write down what you think, and then press play when you're ready to find out. All right. So I don't know about you, but I'm pretty protective over my food. Like if I'm eating McDonald's fries and someone takes one of them, I'm gonna slap them. I want my fry, okay? And these birds are no different. These birds are going to be very competitive over their food because last time I checked, they want to be able to survive and reproduce. Remember those buzzwords from last unit, right? And so what's going to end up happening is these birds that all eat the same type of food, if they're found on the same island, they're going to be competing for resources. So you've got two options you could have said. You could have said the large tree finch, or you could have said the woodpecker finch. As long as you noticed or noted that both of them eat mainly animal food. They eat the same types of food. So if they're on the same island, they're going to be fighting over those same resources. Now, this graph, this diagram, is actually going to be found on another state-mandated lab that we have to do either later this week or next, called the beaks of finches. So you will see this graph again. In fact, this graph or this diagram loves to show up on the regents. So please make sure you guys know how to read this graph. But again, we will go over this again once we do that lab in class. Okay, but let's move on. I just mentioned the beaks of finches lab, and that's actually what this lesson is kind of preparing you for. Evolution, we're going to talk about them a little bit more in ecology because we've got that lab to do. So as we read through this passage, I want you guys to underline anything that you think is important, and then we're going to use this information to answer the questions on the next slide and at the bottom of your worksheet. All right, so what do we need to know about the beaks of finches? Well, part of Darwin's voyage included a visit to the Galapagos Islands in the Pacific Ocean, close to South America. Islands form a very important piece of evidence in Darwin's theory because they isolate populations from one another. If those populations are isolated by a geographic barrier, what do we call it? Oh, geographic isolation. So now let's keep reading this story. A long time ago, a small flock of sparrow-like birds called finches were blown out to sea by a fierce storm. They lost their bearings, so dramatic, but flew on in search of the mainland, going further and further out by sea. At the point of exhaustion, 600 miles from home, they spotted a speck of land, an island in the middle of the sea. They were saved, and they could rest, drink, and feed before returning home. But this island was perfect. It had abundant seeds and other food, plenty of shelter, nesting sites, and amazingly, no predators or other birds to compete with. Life was so much harder on the mainland. There was no need for the birds to move on. Honestly, I get it. I want to go to this island too. So what happened was they were pretty happy. They had lots of resources and they got to survive and reproduce. So their numbers grew until they became just a bit too numerous for the little island. Some found it hard to have enough food for themselves or find enough food for themselves or their offspring. And young birds were driven away from where food was available. Some birds were forced to fly across the sea to nearby islands. There they found new territories, also with no predators or other birds to compete with. As the plants and their seeds were just a little bit different on each island, some birds were better than others at finding and eating the new food sources. Birds, which could break open fruits and eat the seeds, survived well enough to produce lots of babies. Eventually, after a very long time, all of the islands became occupied by these birds, but the finches on each island were slightly different. Scientists believe that this story is just the sort of scenario that happens when new volcanic islands like the Galapagos are colonized by animals and plants. It shows how a theory has to include a plausible mechanism to explain events. The questions in this activity below are similar to those which a scientist like Darwin would have to deal with when presenting his theory to other skeptical scientists. So now, using that information that we just got in the passage, let's answer these questions. So now, number one, explain why it's unlikely that more than one flock of birds would find the islands in this way at the same time. Well, remember, at the very beginning of this passage, we said that these finches were blown out to sea by a fierce storm. So the island was a long way from the mainland and a very large ocean. Many of these animals or many of these birds probably aren't going to find the island unless they're also blown off course by the same weather pattern. So they were blown way off course by this storm, and it's really just a matter of chance that they ended up where they did. So because it was so far away from the mainland, many other birds probably won't find this island on their own. But now number two, suggest two plausible reasons or two possible reasons why there were no predators on this island. What do you guys think? Well, it's possible that the island was relatively new and there was not a lot of food yet there. But it's also possible that other animals could not get there as easily as birds, right? Thankfully, birds have wings, which allow them to fly places. But if you're a predator that does not have wings, you're probably going to have a tougher time getting to that island unless you can swim. So it's possible that those predators just hadn't made their way yet because it was really just hard to get there. That island was geographically isolated. Now, why were there no other birds to compete with? Well, similarly, it could just be that the island was relatively new and no other birds had made their way there yet. Right, number four, why might some finches survive better than others on the same food sources? What do we think? Well, based on the size and shape of their beak, some birds are going to be better fit for those islands' food sources. Remember looking at that diagram earlier, we saw that each of these birds had different beaks that were equipped for different mechanisms, right? We saw that our small tree finch had biting tips and grasping bills, but if we look over here, our small ground finch has a beak with edge-crushing tips and crushing bills, and then our warbler finch has got a probing bill, right? They're all equipped for different jobs. And so because of that, based on the different food sources that are available, some are going to be better equipped and more fit for that environment than others will be. All right, and number five, why were those finches slightly different on each island? Well, think about what we know about natural selection. Think about what we know about the Galapagos Islands and how each of those environments were different. Well, the reason that those finches were different is because they evolved to feed on seeds and other foods which were different on each island. Remember the process of natural selection, where the environment is choosing those traits that are going to be passed on. So because there were different food sources and different climates and different environments, those birds that were separated, geographically isolated on each island, evolved a little bit differently, just depending on the environment that they were present in and what foods were available. All right. So the very last thing we're going to do today is talk about a niche. You might also pronounce this a niche. Either one is the same. It doesn't matter. Now, we've actually heard this word before, and we said that a niche is basically where an organism is most comfortable. It's what it's best at doing. But I want us to actually write down that a niche is basically an organism's job in the environment. So how the organism gets food determines or decides what niche or job it has. So what we really need to write down is that a niche is an organism's role in the environment. And this includes what it eats, where it lives, its relationship with other species, etc. So a niche is what an organism does best, where it's most comfortable, what it eats, where it lives, all of those fun things combined into this big package called niche. Okay, it's basically just its role or job in the environment. So because of this, organisms that have the same niche or the same job are going to compete or fight for resources. right? Because if we've got two organisms that eat the same food or live in the same place, they're going to be competing or fighting over resources if they have that same niche. But if organisms don't have the same niche, if they're in different niches or have different jobs, they're not too worried about each other. They're not going to compete or fight for resources because they don't eat the same food, they don't live in the same place. They're really just not concerned with each other, okay? So niches are super important. And most every organism on this earth has a different niche, okay? And that's why we have this great big circle of life, right? Because each animal is equipped for a different job. But if an organism does have the same niche and does eat the same food, does live in the same place, that is where competition is going to start to get pretty dicey, okay? But that's all I've got for you guys today. So as long as you complete the exit ticket and turn these in on Google Classroom, you are good to go. And I will see you guys soon. Have a wonderful day.